Good evening, everybody. It's 7 o'clock Eastern time, which means it's go time. Welcome back to our ongoing 14-5 author series. As always, it's a tremendous pleasure to be here. If this is your first time, thanks for checking us out. I'm Sean Murphy, and I'm the executive director of 1455, and we are a nonprofit arts organization. We are obsessed with storytelling, and we love storytellers. So virtually all of our free programming is directed toward author interview readings like you're going to have tonight. We have a workshop series, we have interviews, we have a summer festival, which we just announced, our third annual. You can check out all of that at our website at 1455litarts.org. I'll also put that in the comments. We'd love to hear from you and let us know what you think of our programming. And as always, if it's an author event, that means we are partnering with our pals from DC's historic The Potter's House in DC. It is always a pleasure and privilege to welcome Talia Jaffe to the screen. Talia, thank you for being here. And as always, I would love you to talk a little bit about yourself and the amazing work you and your team do at Potter's House.
Absolutely. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. I'm Talia Jaffe, the Events and Operations Manager here at the Potter's House. We're delighted to have you all here and to welcome Whitney here tonight. As always, we are so grateful for our partnership with 1455 Literary Arts and to Sean specifically for always bringing us together and partnering with us through thick and thin. For those of you who don't already know the Potter's House, welcome. For those of you that don't know, a quick plug to share that the Potter's House is a nonprofit social enterprise. We're a bookstore, a cafe, and an event space, and we've been serving up radical hospitality in the Adams Morgan neighborhood since 1960. We're currently open for takeout and book browsing from 8:30 a.m. to 2:30 p.m. every single day. And during those hours, we offer a warm meal and cup of coffee to anyone who needs, no questions asked. If you or someone you know are in need of daily meals, please send them our way. We're especially thrilled to have Whitney here with us tonight this evening because her new collection of short stories are simply brilliant. As Publishers Weekly noted, Whitney's appreciation for our world's strange horrors is in fact contagious, and in doing so helps us reckon with the big bads in each of us. I'm so excited for you all to experience her stories with us tonight. You can purchase your copy of Big Bad from our bookshop.org storefront. I'll drop the link in the event comments momentarily. Again, thank you all for joining us, and to Whitney and Sean, thank you in advance for what I know will be an incredibly meaningful dialogue.
Thank you so much, Talia. Let's get it on. So this is a big week. This is Whitney's book birthday the other day, and in fact, I'm just going to hold this up because her book is so hot off the presses that I don't even have a physical copy. I read it in true 2021 fashion online, which of course it reads well on Kindle. I can't wait to get my paperback so I can dog ear all my favorite parts. But Whitney, it's an absolute pleasure to have you here the week your book goes live. I'm so excited. Let me properly introduce you. Let me read and introduce you all to Whitney, and then we'll jump in. Whitney Collins is the author of the short story collection Big Bad, which is out from Saraban Books. It won the 2019 Mary McCarthy Prize in Short Fiction. In addition, she received a 2020 Pushcart Prize, a 2020 Pushcart Prize Special Mention, and won the 2020 American Shorter Fiction Prize. Her fiction has appeared or is forthcoming in Agni, Shenandoah, American Short Fiction, Slice, The Pinch, Ninth Letter, Grist, the Chattahoochee Review, and Catapult's Tiny Nightmares anthology, among others. Previously, Whitney was a contributing editor for The Weaklings, which is where she and I first met, a book reviewer for Barnes & Noble, and an editorial board member at The Big Jewel. Her nonfiction can be found on various sites, including McSweeney's Internet Tendency, Salon, and Huffington Post, and we will definitely put a link to her website into the comments and when I do my write-up afterwards. But Whitney, author of Big Bad, congratulations and welcome. It's so wonderful to have you here tonight.
Well, thank you for having me. And I think this is the first time I've actually gotten to see you live and talk to you. I think it's always been email. So It's as close as it gets in COVID land.
That's right. Well, it's like it was inevitable, but yeah, our relationship is kind of traced the whatever I guess the aughts or the first decade, whatever the second decade of the 20th century. But we met at a digital magazine, and yeah, all email,
Right.
and here we are, as live as one can get. And I'd be remiss to not point out that I'm speaking to a Kentucky author. So I think it's in the Constitution and obligatory to lift a bourbon. I don't want the ghost of Hunter Thompson to haunt me, so I poured that out of respect and tribute.
Oh, that's great.
So yeah, I mean, on a personal note, it's so cool to finally be in real time and meet properly. But what a perfect occasion for it! And I just want to tee it up with some very genuine praise. I mean, it's always a weird situation when you know a writer and you're familiar with a writer's work before you read one of their books, because of course you want it to measure up and you have expectations. I can say with genuine enthusiasm, I'm a big fan of your writing, but I still was blown away. What a joy and a relief that someone you want to write a great book writes a great book. So I thank you for making this easy for me. And the way I wanted to tee this up is I offer it as the most high compliment that these are not New Yorker stories. That's not to say they couldn't or shouldn't appear in the New Yorker, but these are definitely not your typical middle-aged white angst, worrying about romance and where they're going to spend their summer at the beach house and which college student they're banging. This is the nitty-gritty. That you go in so many different places, and it seems to me anyway, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts on this as a writer and a reviewer. It does seem like it's almost the de facto marketing angles that an author kind of masters a perspective, and a collection or a novel is hammering home this insider view. This is to me such a refreshing throwback where you're all over the place. You're in the Midwest, you're in the South, you're in fantasy land to a certain extent, you're in dreams, you're in nightmares, but this is definitely a book that is giving a myriad of perspectives. So maybe to talk about how this collection came together, how long did it take to put these stories together, and where did all this juicy stuff come from?
Okay, well, thank you for a lovely introduction. Yes, this is a very varied collection of stories, and it just happened organically. I began the collection in my MFA program at Spalding University in Louisville. And so the very first story that I really tinkered with in the collection and as a graduate student, this was in 2016, was Daddy-O. And that was a story that toyed with magical realism. I had never done that before. And I had this like half-written story that I brought to my first workshop. I had that and The Pupil. And The Pupil was very, very realistic first person. And Daddy-O is this kind of strange point of view. It's magic realism. It was unfinished, and I brought it to one of my workshops, and I thought, I want to go down this path, but I don't really know how. So those were kind of my first two stories, and they were really, really different. And then from there, I thought, well, let's just keep trying different characters, different angles, different points of view. One of my first mentors at Spalding, her name's Leslie Daniels. She wrote Cleaning Nabokov's House. We're supposed to bring our own reading list as a grad student and say, these are the books that I want to read this semester. And my list read like somebody who had been out of school 20 years. It was like Jane Eyre and Pride and Prejudice, and, with a couple of and she was like, what is this? She goes, you need to go right now and read Kelly Link and Ramona Oswald. And she named some of these fantastic writers that I was sadly not familiar with, that were doing amazing stuff with magic realism. And it changed my life. It was just like, it was like when you read an author that resonates with you on a very deep level and just gives you permission to be experimental. So with that said, and with like a completely contemporary and wild reading list and these two stories that were really different, I just started writing and I was all over the place. And I'm like, I'm just going to write. I'm going to just go with it. So I ended up with 16 stories. And in this collection, we chose 13, which, it's a lucky number.
Indeed. Indeed. Well, I plan to talk to you a little more about magic realism and fantasy and some of this this intersection of the hyper real and the surreal. I made a list of, while I was reading and imagining like I was going to write a book review, and here's what I wrote down. You tell me what I missed, because this is just a small sampling. But for those of you that are like, okay, this sounds good so far, tell me if this doesn't get your attention. Missing limbs, unborn babies, absent fathers, the cycle of death and birth, not necessarily natural in either case. There's repression, denial, the ache of loss, and of course, love, unrealized, unrequited, unwanted, pervading all these stories. And believe it or not, that's just scratching the surface. But in addition to just saying the stories work on a line by line level, the writing's gorgeous, emotionally affecting. But my opinion, my firm conviction is that somebody can't write about those things and with that authority of so many different angles on the human experience without having experience, which isn't to say, it is to say, I would be shocked if this writing came from a young 20-something. I'm not talking about either of our ages so much as these stories do seem to exude the confidence and authority of someone that has engaged with the real world.
Yeah, and that was another thing that Leslie said, my first fantastic mentor. She said, your stories are going to be the most successful if you just put it all on the page. So, that's not easy to do because you have to feel your own pain and you literally have to relive the pain and the experience and the heartache and the joy too. I mean, the spectrum of emotion, if you want to inject your work with emotion. So, at first I really resisted that because I thought, well, if I put emotion on the page, that seems, a lot of times my fear was that it would come across as trite or sentimental. Writing about love can be really cheesy, and or writing about heartache can be really whiny. And I thought, how do you do that and make it have some heft to it and not be flimsy? And I think the way that I found to do that was to be really blunt and to be really unapologetic and to be willing to balance the emotional with the gory. And I'm not just talking about like physical gore. I mean, so there is some of that in the stories too, but just the really rawness of, I think if you get to the rawness of an emotion in your writing, then it holds up a little bit better than just saying I was sad or I was in love or so. And I think as a writer, and I write about this a little bit, I was thinking about this today, that, what are our stories to tell? And in today's climate, I think that's a really important question to ask, because as fiction writers, we have great imaginations. And sometimes we convince ourselves, well, if I can think it, then I should write it. And, we have to be really aware of especially race and culture and experience and gender and all these things that we're all really having open conversations about these days, which is fantastic. I think we have to be extremely aware of what our experience is, and that is what we write about, even if we think we can imagine what someone else's is. So, for example, in Big Bad, there's a story called Drawers, and it's about an older man who hits a horse en route to his grandson's circumcision, which, that happens every day. But ironically, I don't know if you remember this. I mean, that story tackles exactly what we're tackling in the news right now. That story takes place in Georgia, and he has this fetishization, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, with the roadside spas. He never enters them. He thinks about this, and I don't directly discuss race in that story.
Right.
Because as a white woman, I didn't feel like that was my place, but I allude to what I think is going on in his mind. And I think that these are conversations we have to have. But going back to the emotion, how you get emotion on the page, you really have to tell your story and make a list of what has deeply affected you in life and what you've been, have you been bullied? Have you had untimely deaths in your family? Has there been divorce in your family? Has there been addiction in your family? You can make these lists and check them off and say, wow, I kind of have some authority about these heavy topics.
Yeah. Yeah. And, I think this is more directed toward white men, and as it should be. But I think we're very sensitive and aware of kind of authorial, the liberties creatives take. And so to me, it was both refreshing and a real feat, which is not implying that men can't write about women or like women and vice versa. But that story in particular, it's very brave. And there's some audacity in writing so compellingly, not just about an older white male, because again, well, that's imagination, but to write about repression and the feelings that an unfulfilled, unhappy man might have. And one of to me the power of really good fiction or storytelling is also, of course, what it leaves unsaid. And so a book could be written just about what's bubbling beneath the surface in that one story, and how it relates to what these things might lead to: violence, lack of communication, unhappiness. There's a recurring theme, of course, of miscommunication or unhappiness in relationships and families. And it's like, well, who doesn't know about that? So there is a
that's why Thanksgiving is always such a success.
Right. Yeah. And so I think it would be a very shallow observation, even if meant as a compliment, to say, wow, you've experienced some things, because it's always tricky to assume or associate the author with the material. But I think what we're getting at is the notion of these are both universal feelings, but also I love the way you said, you make a list and what's in your wheelhouse.
Yeah.
What do you feel strongly about? Because how is the reader going to feel engaged if the author is clearly not coming from a place that's felt?
Right. And I do think that the best stories are the ones that are very personal. And I think that, people are going to read, now, with me saying this, people are going to read Big Bad now and be like, oh, where am I? This must be, oh, they're all true stories.
Right.
And the truth is that all the characters are fictional and all the scenarios are fictional, but all of the emotion is personal. And a lot of the things that the characters have experienced, I have experienced, or someone very close to me has. So it's like, I think you can write definitely about your really close world, what has happened to you. And I think you can write a couple of rings out. Like if you're thinking about like Saturn, like you think you can go a couple of rings out, we know what our children have gone through. We know what our fathers, our husbands, we can kind of get into the mind a few rings out. Once we're outside of that, it's tricky.
Right. Yeah, I mean, we're really getting at, the art and the craft of storytelling. And I think, you clearly can speak positively about your own workshop experiences. And, I think the immature writer feels inoculated by the fact that they say, but this is true. It's like, that has nothing to do with successful fiction. That this really happened. Congratulations, you're writing, that's journal entries. The art is exactly what you described, taking something that has a foundation and feels true. And I think writers tend to surprise themselves when some of the stuff they write, but I think it proves that it's all boiling around back in the subconscious, and we have to kind of be in awe of who knows what's marinating emotionally that we're not aware of, day to day. But when it comes
Right.
time to think about it creatively, there may be things that have been working their way out in very deep ways, and all of a sudden it flows out very easily. But it's the artifice to make it look like it was inevitable, and you're able to do that.
Well, thank you. I don't know how, there was a lot of editing and sweat but it is weird. You're right. Like, one of the hardest questions for me to ever answer is where do you get your ideas? Where did the stories come from? Because a lot of them just, it's like appear. Like I'm like, oh, I got to write a story about a guy that hits a horse.
Right.
And I'm like, where did that come from? And so then I'll think, okay, well, why? Okay, the guy hits a horse, but what ups the stakes? And then that's where the different scenarios, experiences, emotions come in. But I love playing the what if games, like especially creepy ones. Like, what if I went to the mailbox and something weird was in the mailbox? And then, that's a great way to get out of the writer's block, is this kind of this what if. And then you can inject some magic realism, you can inject some symbolism in there, you can, and then what? And then you can play that game with yourself. And
Right.
that's really fun. So, and always a little disturbing as to where's that coming from?
Right. Well, and we could go down that rabbit hole of there's exceptions to every rule, but I think about, I think one of my favorite quotes is Anthony Burgess said, the novelist lives vicariously, like, creates the horrors on the page that their boring everyday life can't approximate. Or the point being, anyone that sees a writer that writes compellingly about disturbing things and assumes therefore that person is depraved, that's so shallow and dumb. But we have some of our best writers, male, female, different generations, that are able to go there. And I would maintain that in many cases, it's because someone is able to look with a clinical precision without having to necessarily know what those feelings are. What a perfect segue to hearing the author read. I would love you to
Do you have
read from this collection a story of your choosing.
I was gonna read, I think one of the best stories, the first, because you said about 5 minutes, and I kind of went through the stories, and the one story that has just a really good 5-minute feel, and I probably am going to go a little bit over, but
Totally can go over.
is The Nest, which is the beginning story.
Yeah.
It's a little grotesque in parts, so not too bad. I don't know if I'll get to the super grotesque parts, but this story originally appeared in Moon City Review, which is outside of St. Louis, or in St. Louis. And there was a wonderful literary magazine called Glimmer Train that is now in retirement. But this story was kind of recognized in their summer fiction open. So I got really excited about that. I was like, oh, maybe I'll start submitting that more places. So this one was really nice and creepy. It's always great when you get like a thumbs up for being creepy, because it's always like my mom used to say, don't encourage her, because, it's like all you need is a little bit of encouragement, and then it just gets, it's like a snowball going downhill. So
Indeed.
Okay, so this is The Nest. On Tuesday, Frankie's father took her 2 places against his better judgment. The first was to see her premature brothers at Our Lady of the Peace NICU. 3 days prior, and 60 days too early, James and Jasper had slipped out of Frankie's mother like a pair of feeble insects that doctors promptly secured under glass for observation, both scientific and sacred. In the ensuing emergency, Frankie's father, unable to locate a sitter, deposited his 6-year-old daughter on the foot of his blind mother's nursing home bed with a naked baby doll and a box of sun-made raisins. For 2 days, Frankie watched The Young and the Restless and Who Wants to Be a Millionaire from a vinyl recliner, eating saltines and applesauce and drinking Boost, while her grandmother's friends leaned on walkers in the doorway, admiring her like a misplaced peacock. She's a prodigy, the grandmother claimed. She's in 1st grade and can balance a checkbook. She knows all the Canadian provinces. Every so often, the grandmother would run her fingers over Frankie's soft face as if her eyebrows were made of braille and tell her the baby brothers would probably die. They're like worms on a summer sidewalk, child. They don't stand a chance in the heat of this world. To Frankie, this honesty felt so much like affection, she sometimes asked her grandmother to repeat herself, which the grandmother did with gusto, adding details about Frankie's father and her uncle Eric, how they weren't born early, but they'd been stuck together at the hip, and the doctors had to slice the grandmother open to remove them. I was the one who almost died, she said. Those boys were laying inside me side by side like a butterfly. Your father, he got the hip. Eric, he never was right. At this, the grandmother patted Frankie's face and body with her hands. Looks like you'll make it, she said. You're one of the lucky ones. Then Frankie, full of herself, excused herself to faux tap dance in the hallway for nickels, making $4 in one commercial break, enough to buy just one brother something in the hospital gift shop. Back in the recliner, Frankie covered herself with an Afghan that smelled of menthol. She saw that her grandmother was on the verge of sleep, so she asked, "Did it hurt when they pulled the babies out of you?" Her grandmother jolted, frowned, then nodded. "It was hell," she quietly moaned. "Oh, child, let me tell you, I know hell." Frankie thought about this in the dark while the mute television featured a man selling electric grills that nothing stuck to, not even cheese. Frankie knew a little bit about hell, about how in October she turned 7, how then she'd be considered responsible for everything she did and everything she thought, how the week before Halloween, Father Greg would be waiting for her and her classmates in the church booth to tell him everything they'd ever done wrong. Frankie had already started the list in her mind. She had stolen a pack of juicy fruit from the drugstore when she was 4. She had dropped one of her mother's diamond earrings down the drain on accident and never told on purpose when she was 5. And once, just a month ago, when her mother was too pregnant to get off the park bench, Frankie had come across a boy inside the playground tunnel beating a rock against a limp chipmunk. When he offered her a turn, she said okay, but made the mistake of wrapping her hand completely around the rock so that when she hit the chipmunk, her knuckles could feel its bones break, could feel how it was still warm. Frankie had decided to only mention the gum to Father Greg, which would be another sin. The more Frankie thought about it, the more she couldn't see a way to keep herself out of hell, but she fell asleep regardless. On Tuesday, the nursing home manager came to the grandmother's room. He stood in the doorway and explained that Frankie, by law, had to leave. Frankie gathered up her things, but not before noticing that the toes of the man's shoes were wrapped in black tape to hold the soles on. In his office, he called her father and said, "Either you or the police can come pick her up." Can we stop there?
I say keep going.
Okay, I'll go a little bit longer. We got to get Uncle Eric in there.
We are 100%.
Okay, so that was a natural break in it anyway. So last November, to everyone's surprise, Uncle Eric called to invite Frankie and her parents to Thanksgiving dinner at his house. "He says your mother will be there with her nurse," Frankie's mother said to Frankie's father. "Maybe he's finally trying." "Right," her father said. "Don't hold your breath." On the day of the party, Frankie's mother dressed Frankie in her brown sash dress and her gray wool coat with the brass buttons. Frankie had only met her uncle once before at her grandfather's funeral. She remembered he'd stood under a pine tree away from the crowd, holding an umbrella, even though it wasn't raining. "Will any kids be there?" Frankie asked. "No," her mother said, "just you." When they arrived at his house, Frankie could barely contain herself. The bungalow was painted bright purple with an orange front door, and on the roof, attached to the chimney with duct tape, was a faded plastic Santa Claus. "Jesus," her father sighed. "David," her mother said. For dinner, instead of turkey and stuffing and a normal-sized pumpkin pie that fed 8 people, Eric served each guest a tiny roasted quail and minuscule mounds of sweet potatoes scooped with a melon baller and dwarfed apple tarts the size of poker chips. In her whole young life, Frankie had never been so delighted. There were ropes of blue tinsel over every doorway and glitter sprinkled on the tablecloth, and 6 strangers at the meal who were no relation to Frankie or her parents or her blind grandmother, but who loved on Frankie more than she'd ever been loved on before. Strangers who looked like women but talked like men and smoked cigarettes as long as chopsticks and cried every time a song came on the radio. "The dishes," Eric announced at dinner, pinching up a teacup for everyone to see, "are antique dolls' china from Russia." Frankie inspected her plate with awe. The dinner guests, the ones who weren't family, gasped. "They belong to Anna Rasputin," Uncle Eric said. "Anna goddamn Rasputin. That's how much I love you all." Frankie ate 4 apple tarts and 11 scoops of sweet potatoes. Her quail was so precious, she wrapped it in her napkin, then excused herself to the bathroom. She found her winter coat in the hallway and placed the bird in its inner silk pocket. Frankie noticed her father did not eat. Frankie noticed her grandmother's nurse excused the grandmother from the dining room table and fed her from a paper plate in the living room. Frankie noticed her mother spent the whole meal watching Frankie's father in the same way she watched Frankie when she ran a fever. Frankie noticed Uncle Eric noticed none of this. After dinner, Uncle Eric took Frankie upstairs to his bedroom, where he showed her a red toddler-sized piano. We must bring this downstairs, he said, flushed and wide-eyed. We've got to keep the teeny tiny theme going. Frankie nodded in agreement. What do you play, Frankie? Furlies? Please tell me you play Furlies. Frankie was worried. She only knew the Mayflower song. I only know the Mayflower song, she said. That's perfect, Uncle Eric said, placing the piano on the shoulder opposite his cane. Because guess who invented Thanksgiving, sugar? The motherfucking Pilgrims, that's who. On their way downstairs with the piano, Frankie and Uncle Eric met Frankie's father on his way upstairs. It's time to go, Frankie. Your mother's waiting on the porch. Uncle Eric stomped a foot. You're leaving, he huffed, but Frankie was just going to play us a song. Frankie's father shook his head. Frankie will not be participating in your circus, Eric. Circus? Uncle Eric exclaimed. That's what you call this? Uncle Eric waved his cane in all directions. I spent 6 days getting this ready. Do you know how hard it was to find 12 quail that would fit on that china? I took one of Anna Rasputin's doll plates around to 4 butchers and then a farm. 4 butchers and a farm, David. Frankie stood and watched. Uncle Eric's blue eyelids looked heavy. Her father had his feet on 2 different steps as if he might pounce. Why can't you just do things the regular way? Her father said. Why couldn't there have been a normal turkey? And why all these people, Eric? Answer me that. Uncle Eric patted his pockets with the crook of his cane. Frankie knew he was looking for a cigarette. I'll tell you why, her father continued. It's because it's never about anybody but you. It's about what you want. It's about drawing attention to yourself. It's not about Thanksgiving or family. It's about Eric, the Eric Show. I'm gonna do you want me to, when we do the toss the piano?
Oh, of course.
Frankie, it's one little paragraph. Frankie looked at her uncle. She wondered what he might say, how he might make her father feel terrible for what he'd just done. But Uncle Eric said nothing. He simply lifted the toy piano off his shoulder and into the air with one hand, and then threw the piano down the stairs, over Frankie's father's head and onto the first floor landing, where it jangled and splintered in a way that almost made Frankie laugh. It was exciting to see her father scared, even for a flash. That's...
I mean, Whitney, listen, it's borderline unprofessional to gush, but to me, the mastery of all of that, there's almost Salinger-esque with, the precocious young girl, but to tell it from her perspective, which, I mean, it has to be, but gives that's the distance that story needs for all of the things that an adult reading that, for that to hit. And for that to really resonate, the fact that the narrator is not perceiving everything and what's unspoken, and the multitude of details, there's so much. What you're able to do there throughout that story, and in a lot of these stories, is the mastery of compression. That it's generously written, but you do it in a way that you don't have to, it doesn't have to be 80 pages, because everyone can very quickly pick up the dynamic and the dysfunction and what's going on. Just masterful and hilarious. So I'm actually glad. I don't think we've scared anyone off, and we better not have scared anyone off, because you guys got to get this book. But there's plenty of humor and lightness and love of life that abounds in these pages. But it's not afraid to pull the covers off and look at some dark stuff.
Yeah, I feel like every story has to have comedy for me to enjoy it. And that's not just going for the stories I write, but the stories I read. I love just darkness and, the comic and the tragic, right hand in hand. It makes it easier to swallow the hard stuff. And, it keeps the comedy from looking, self-serving and,
performative,
right. So it's weird. the more I write, the more it's sometimes like listening to a song. I have no musical talent whatsoever, but I imagine that when someone's trying to work out something musically, they just know when it doesn't sound right, and they just keep working over it and over it and over it, like on the guitar, and they're like, that just doesn't hit right. To me, all guitar sounds beautiful because it's impossible for me to play. But
Yeah.
as a writer, like I'll go over a paragraph a couple times and I'm like, it's just not, what is going on there?
Yeah.
So a lot of it's kind of intuitive.
Yes, and I think you're again, we're getting back to craft in a beautiful way. The notion of this combination of intuition, practice, instinct, and hard work. Because I think I said earlier, I'm glad I have the opportunity to circle back. I made a comment that was definitely meant as in complimentary terms, but by no means that I want to imply like, yeah, these stories just flow out of you.
No.
The compliment was, when the finished product looks inevitable, and is easy to swallow for the reader, that's a real gift. I think we make the mistake with music, movies, and literature. Like, of course, it's impossible to understand. That's because it's deep. It's like, yeah, but that's narcissistic at a certain point. I think the authors that are able to make the medicine go down, you don't even know it hits you. That's really powerful.
Well, and there is a lot of work behind the stories, but there are the occasional stories that do just fly out. They're very rare, but every once in a while I'll just sit down and it happens like once a year.
Yeah.
That I sit down and all of a sudden, and one of the stories with that happened like that was the second story, which is called Sunday Now, with the bologna machine. And I don't know where that came from. I sat down that I don't even know. I don't even want to put my name on the story. It's like I channeled it. Like it came down and I came out and I was like, okay, that is just really weird. I don't know where that story came from, but it kind of feels finished. And it was one of those stories that didn't need a lot of editing. And then other stories are just excruciating to write.
Right. All right. So let me lay this on you, and forgive me in advance because maybe it shows my own lack of my own ill-read repertoire, but I think it's safe to say at this point that most of us are obliged to recognize that George Saunders is kind of a generational talent in terms of not just the writing and the success, but this humanity and this inimitable style that now I'm noticing a lot more people take either taking shortcuts or just because they don't have the talent. But I want to say this to you with complete sincerity, and utmost respect. You're probably the first writer I've read that captures that whimsy and humor and humanity that's combined with some boundary pushing elements, which I think is his calling card. So whether or not you're consciously emulating or imitating, that is absolutely not my point. My point is I read him with awe and envy, and see how he's kind of cultivated this ability to use humor, to use what seems like whimsy, but is really hard hitting. I'm curious, if what he's done for you, or you'd already mentioned two authors, but obviously I don't think many of us in our 20s or as young writers have the ability to do some of the things you do. So again, I'm not saying that you couldn't have written these as a younger writer, but anyway, the compliment, George Saunders, this is the first thing I've read where I could say that's Saunders-esque and mean it as a tremendous compliment. But I'd love you to just talk a little bit about your influences.
Well, that's crazy, and thank you, and that means a lot because I adore him. I think that the humanity in his stories. I mean, he is one of the few writers that I read and I just cry. And can be howling like 3 paragraphs before, but like the title story, 10th of December. I put that book down and I had to go like have a really good cry because I was like, how does he do that?
Yeah.
That's really it's remarkable. So he is a great influence. Kelly Link, I have her book here. This was the book that I read that just changed my life, Get in Trouble.
Okay.
This was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. It's a collection of short stories, and they are just insanely clever and masterful and magical. And I mean, she's just the queen of magic realism, in my opinion. So I read this, I put it down, and I was like, okay, like, anything goes. It's not the days of, like,
Yeah.
ninth grade where I'm reading Salinger, who's a genius, but those are very specific types of, like you were saying before, the New Yorker story, where it's, everything's 15 pages, everything has the exact same, like,
Yes.
beginning, conflict, it follows this path. And there's a little bit of causation in that sort of traditional plot line where everything is propelled kind of in similar ways. But Kelly Link, I was like, what is she just? So this is amazing. This book was amazing. I don't have Ramona Oswald's book here, but I've read several of hers. She also is incredible with magical realism, and also just this earthiness about her book's called A Guide to Being Born. I believe I have the title right. About, not afraid to talk about the physical world and giving birth and death and all these things that some people shy away from. Otessa Moshfegh, I don't know if you're familiar with her. She might be the bravest writer that I have read lately. I mean, she is not shying away from all sorts of scary things and gross things and guttural things. And so you combine all those together, and I thought, okay, who are my favorite writers right now? And there was this magic that I was seeing theme in some of my favorite authors. There was just the bravery to be scary, gross, to tell it like it is. And then George Saunders, I mean, he can be hilarious and just, devastating, like from one paragraph to the next.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
You just, I have this belief, if you read one really great story a day and write one page a day, at the end of the year, you've read almost 400 stories and you've written almost 400 pages. I don't do that consistently, but those are achievable goals. Some people sit down and say, I have to write 10 pages every day. There's no way I can do that.
Right. Well, and I'm really glad you mentioned that, Whitney, because that's a theme that comes up necessarily throughout this series and the 1455 interview, which is there is no one path. You have the writers that, and I'm in awe of, I wake up at 4 a.m. and I swim 50 laps and I write for 4 hours and then I answer my emails and then I have breakfast and then I write for 4. But for some, people with kids or people with 3 jobs, like I think what I always want to tell, especially younger writers, aspiring authors, is I think the key is to be engaged, and by that, I mean with a capital E, you need to read a lot. You need to write a lot. You have to write really badly all the time, but you have to be wanting to learn and absorb, and you're absorbing experience and you're absorbing what good literature does. And like we talked about earlier, even if that's not a how-to guide per se, it's all going in there, and you read good writing and it's teaching you things. And so all of those things I think are important, but I hear you. Like, I think it's probably, it's not unlike physical exercise. Like there's goals. You should run or do whatever every day. Okay. But if you do it 5 times a week, that's better than 3. And you do it twice a week is better than 0. So I always want to kind of poo-poo the kind of holier than thou, like,
yeah,
your 1,000 pages every day. It's like, yeah, if you can do that for a variety of reasons, that's great. But for some of us humans or mere mortals, write 100 pages, write 100 words.
I am always, I think the saddest thing that I've realized about life is I'll never get to read everything I want to read. Like, that makes me really sad. There's just no way. And I'm really bad about reading a lot in one sitting. And it's because I've got 2 kids, I've got 5 pets, I've got to be over here, there. And it's, it's just life gets in the way of everything I want to read and everything I want to write. And so it's like, if I can just put it in manageable chunks and, maybe I can't read before bed because forget it, I fall asleep. So I've learned, don't try to take in the inspiration right before bed.
Right.
And for me, I'm not one of those people that can just get right out of bed and sit down with a notebook and start writing short stories. I mean, I'm one of those people that, okay, around 10:30, that's when, things are finally quiet and I can maybe get 250, 400 words out if I'm lucky. Some days that is not happening.
Sure. Well, and listen, Whitney, I would say, I think I've already intimated this, but I'll say it explicitly. Listen, everyone has a different thing. I would encourage, any writer that can write anything at any time.
Right.
Full encouragement and support for me as an enthusiast. But I would maintain, without trying to be a hater, that even the ones that are knocking out 2,000 words a day, is it shitty writing? Like, to me, the fact that you are a mother and a wife and a pet owner, and at a certain age that you clearly have absorbed things in the real world, that informs the writing and makes it resonate and makes it important and makes it something that you want to return to. And again, the best compliment I can give you is having just read this book, in the last week. To hear you read, I loved it. So the staying power, right? Like it warrants a second and third reading. That's the greatest glory, as opposed to kind of this arbitrary. You're right, and your point is well taken. You write enough every day, and it's going to add up. Yes, that's all good. But writing something that's important and that people want to read is a heroic achievement.
Well, if it's interesting. Okay, so I went to get my MFA at 23, and I dropped out. I had majored in creative writing at Hamilton College, and about 18 months later, I was like, I'm going to go get my MFA in fiction. And I had just majored in fiction, and I had no life experience. And it was the first year that the Chicago Art Institute had an MFA program. And so it was brand new. I got in, and it was a fantastic program for a brand new program. But my problem was I literally would go back at the end of class and sit in my apartment, and there was nothing coming out of me. Nothing. I mean, I was like, I don't even think I can write a postcard. I mean, it was terrifying. I was like, what's going on?
Uh-huh.
So I did a semester. I don't even think I generated really anything. And I said, it's too much. I can't, I need to go live. I need to accrue some life experiences. And so I actually went and worked for a travel magazine, and I was in the freelance nonfiction world for 20 years. And I never thought I would go back to fiction. And then it just started nagging at me. And about 2016, I was like, that's it. I'm going to jump off, take a chance. I'm going to jump into it and see what happens. And I liken it to kind of like, in that 20 years, I went from having like a really weak chicken soup to like kind of like this like stock. And the minute I sat down, I was like, oh my gosh, like it's just been waiting to be written.
What a brilliant analogy. I like the stock analogy, but I also, again, I mean, I really don't want to come across to anyone watching as a hater. A wonder kid that is 23 and knocking out a novel, like, yes, like just the more the merrier. Right. But I find in my own experience that MFA fiction from 20-somethings reads like MFA fiction from 20-somethings, which is not to suggest that you need to be 40-something with 2 kids or 10 kids, but George Saunders had an interesting life. Many of the writers that endure are not just kind of writing cerebral stuff, from their pointy-headed, existence.
Yeah.
So that the blood and the gore and the lived experience does shine through.
Yeah, and the older you get a little like dehumanized too. Like, oh, the world. Like, yeah. It's good to be a little like broken and a little bit like tired and a little a little bitter, but then you also have this like deeper appreciation for everything. So it's like everything's kind of concentrated once you get to like midlife, and it's that's what's worked for me. Of course, I always read the 30 under 30 lists, and I'm just like, how do these people do it? Like, I'm amazed at the people under a certain age that have this. They've had a past life, is what it is.
Right.
Like several.
Yeah,
And
you know,
they're drawing on that like old wisdom.
or you know, then that gets into the be careful what you wish for, right? Like I've taken comfort in the fact that however illusory this concept is, unlike rock stars and movie stars, writers can age well. You probably get better as you go along if you're doing it the right way, where there seems to be a shelf life. You know, if you're counting on your looks, or to me it seems like, boy, rock stars, even the most brilliant ones, seem to burn out by midlife. So yeah, there's something to be said for accruing that experience and bringing it to bear with the appreciation and experience with craft can yield some good things.
I came across, I'm cleaning out files, and I came across like one thing I had written, like between, it may have been actually my application for the first program.
Yeah.
And it was really painful to read. It was so bad. And I just thought, wow, well, thank you, Chicago, for letting me in. But it just, it was very forced, and sometimes you just have to let, things run their course and appear naturally. So it's been a long journey I've never abandoned writing, but I abandoned fiction for a long time.
Sure.
And it was always, I was writing stories when I was a really little girl. It was always my first passion, my first love, but I just I quit from, let's see, like 95 basically till 2016. So what is that? Don't make me do math.
Right.
That's a long time.
Couple of decades.
20-ish something. Right.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about, I was remiss to not point out when I read the acknowledgments of the book, if I'm not mistaken, every one of those or most of those stories were published in Lit Mags. So congratulations. Awesome. I'd love you to talk a little bit also about, because we haven't really talked about this in this series, contests and how that is a wonderful way for writers to find editors and find endorsements, because so much of these conversations talk about agents and writing that first novel. There of course are many paths toward publication, and you are definitely a refreshing example of, I wouldn't even say non-traditional, because winning a contest is traditional, but you know what I mean? Like, it's not you write a novel, you get an agent, and then you have a career. But talk a little bit about, your experience with contests and what that's done for you.
Well, so, okay, when I graduated, I had my thesis, the 16 stories, and I had another wonderful mentor, Robin Lippincott, who I had for 2 semesters at Spalding. And he was like, I really think you need to submit your thesis as a manuscript to some small presses. And he goes, a lot of them will accept them without agents, and a lot of them have an annual fiction manuscript contest. So I cleaned it up, and I graduated in November of 2018. And then a lot of those contests start January, so 29. So I was like, over the holidays, I was like, I might be crazy. I just graduated, but I'm going to clean it up. Yeah. And when I heard from Saraband, I could not believe it, but it's a beautiful way to enter into the world of publishing. A small press is really intimate. It's a very close relationship that I formed with, my editors and promotion, everything. It's just been very, intimate relationship. But the wonderful thing is that you're not immediately pounding the pavement looking for an agent, and you don't know, finding an agent is not an easy thing. And there's it's kind of like online dating or something. You're trying to figure out, am I a match? Like it said, all the advice they give you is like, are you going to be a match with this agency? And you're kind of like reading their descriptions and you're going, well, I don't know. And so this took away that whole process of trying to generate an agent relationship first before you even got to the publishing process. So
Yeah.
I don't know. I think it's been fantastic with Sarah Brand. They're great. And it's just so I would recommend if people have, especially with collections of short stories, because
Right.
a collection of short story is actually kind of hard to sell to an agent.
That's right. Yeah.
But it can be easier to sell or, submit through contest and through small presses.
Well, right. I mean, and you are, I mean, in that instance, literally cutting out the middlewoman in the sense that, like if someone's running a contest for a short story collection, they read short fiction. Where, right, and you with most agents, and very understandably, short collections tend to not sell well, and that's the name of the game in the literary world. So yada yada, like,
Right.
so
They
yeah,
want the novel, right? And that may be changing just because of who knows. It's going to be really interesting, I think, just with so in addition to people reading more books during the pandemic, people were watching a heck of a lot more TV. So everybody's thinking episodically.
yeah,
So,
yeah,
short stories, episodes, these things tend to be easier to consume at the end of a long day than a giant novel or a movie. So I'm a big cheerleader of the short story. I think it's just a beautiful form for many reasons. But, one of the reasons a lot of people like it is just attention span. But for me, it's the condensing of a plot. It gives you this little box.
that's
do
right.
the work. So
Well, yeah, and I think to write short stories well, there are many, many, many brilliant writers that write novels that can't write short stories, and maybe the converse applies. But I think I think with a novel, if there's a built-in mulligan, like you can forgive entire chapters that don't work or are clunky because it's the scope of the short story. It's like a poem. You don't have any room for error. So someone that masters, or writes a compelling short story, I think is always like a minor miracle. And there are a lot of minor miracles in this collection. So kudos and well done.
thank you so much. This has been wonderful.
Well, so closing thoughts, because I think
Okay.
this is, for me, this is always important to bring up. I think it's a given in 2021 that one doesn't need to live in New York City. Like that's been true for probably a couple of decades. But specifically talking about literary community and just reading your bio, you epitomize, in addition to the contests and the hard work, the slog, the beautiful slog of submitting to literary magazines and getting, advocates through those channels, how important it is to have a literary community. Like we talked about, you and I met at the Weeklings, but then we have friends within our networks. But maybe talk a little bit about, what literary community means to you and why it's important to be a part of one.
Well, okay. So I had no literary community really outside of the Weeklings. I mean, really, that was a beautiful, like refreshing new thing for me because I had been writing kind of book reviews kind of independently and humor independently. And then when Greg and I met up and he was like, oh, you should write something for the Weeklings. And it was great because, creativity breeds creativity and you just kind of feel the I don't know, that sort of communicating back and forth and reading, getting to know other people's voices, and you kind of play off each other. It's great. So the Weeklings kind of really made me realize, oh my gosh, I really miss this. This is kind of similar to what happens in a workshop, what happens in a program. And so Spalding was, when I got into Spalding, I wasn't quite aware of how wonderful their workshop what's the word I want to use? The way they set it up is so non-competitive.
Hmm.
And so many MFA programs have these kind of cutthroat,
Yes.
you will not speak. We will tell you what's wrong with your story. And then you will go back to your dorm room or your hotel room and you will weep and wonder why you're attempting to write fiction.
Right.
And Spalding always said, your competition isn't in the classroom, your competition's in the library. So it was this wonderful, loving, great community of poets. And that's the other thing, it's a really diverse community, not only culturally, but a diverse community in terms of genre. You can get your MFA in poetry, fiction, creative nonfiction, screenwriting, playwriting, writing for children and young adults, and I might be missing one other. I mean, there's like 7 different genres you can specialize in.
Right.
So there's just this vibrant community. And like I said, that there's some accountability there, like everybody is having that same heavy workload. Spalding was crazy. Every 3 weeks, they wanted you to generate around 25 to 30 pages. And you're going, that's when I came up with the page a day.
Right.
Page a day.
Yeah.
So there's accountability there. There's networking there. There's the creative interplay. And I just think it's really important. I mean, we can write alone,
Hmm.
but it's better to have your buddies. I have a really good friend that we meet every Monday on Zoom, and we talk about life. What are you writing? What are you reading? What are your month's goals?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, you're really, what you're doing is you're adding another voice to a recurring theme. I haven't talked to a single person in the last 3 years that has kind of been like, you got to get the work done and then you put it out in the world. Like there's a handful of people, I think, every generation that can do that, and more power to them. But especially in the world we live in now, where the industry is consolidating, it's hyper competitive. There's so much content out there. To be part of something that you're plugged into, where not only can you get your work seen, but you can help lift other people's work. There's joy there. It's not just practical. There's a real joy in helping celebrate what is often very solitary, lonely work. And you meet people that you want to help and you want to shine a light on. I think that validates a lot of the rejection and failure and loneliness.
Yeah. Yeah, because it's brutal getting. I counted today how many rejections I've had in my life, and it's close to 400 rejections. And I've had 22 things accepted. So that acceptance rate is puts MIT to shame.
Right.
Like it's a brutal path. So you have to have your community.
So that is a great note to end on. That underscores your humility and your kind of self-deprecating nature. But the focus of this evening, as it should be, is on the triumph. And I want to take my bullhorn out once again and say to everyone watching, Big Bad is a no-brainer. If you're not a short story reader, this is a great way to either acquaint or reacquaint yourself with this genre and fall back in love with the power of what someone with an unbelievable imagination can do. So, Whitney, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts. Congratulations on this. I know this is going to have a shelf life, pun intended, I guess, but these are stories that are going to endure, and people that read these are going to know who you are. And I think that's a considerable achievement. So I'm inspired by what you've done, and I'm delighted to call you a friend, and thanks for taking some time to talk to us.
Thank you so much. This has been lovely. And maybe someday we'll meet in person.
I know, right? But baby steps, but the fact that we're even in the position of saying, and we might even be able to meet, like a few years ago, I was like, yeah, of course we'll meet at a conference or whatever. But yes, we will lift a celebratory toast in person. But until then, keep writing, and I hope you're able to take a deep breath and celebrate a labor of love that resulted in this beautiful book. Congratulations, and it's our pleasure at 1455 to celebrate that and make sure as many people as possible know about it.
All right. Thank you so
All
much.
right. We will talk to you soon.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.